We've talked in the past about the move from cloud to being on-premise, off-premise, virtual, the geographic constraints. Of late, we've seen quite a lot of attention to virtual private clouds. Amazon just introduced VPC. I sort of contend that for a number of reasons, but also from a jurisdictional and from a security perspective, much more sort of granular control over cloud computing is going to have to happen and will happen to a point where you can specify some sort of regional granularity over your infrastructure instance and those sorts of things. Do you see that sort of stuff helping with the security conundrum?
The security conundrum is quite complex at the present time. There needs to be a complete set of set of processes and procedures put in place. What we're seeing from the virtualization world is whereby we have complete skill sets like security, network, application, and we're expecting the same person to be both a security, network, and application and a server expert all in one. And this is where some of the major issues become, because there's in many cases a lack of discipline, interdiscipline amongst the group, because the actual virtualization expert believes they are the experts in security and network and so on. It's almost impossible for people to actually be a complete overall global expert. So we have to. It's rather like a bunch of cackling geese in a sense. In some ways, those disciplines need to be put in place and adhered to right through that whole area. And regardless of whether it's in country or whether it resides in the data center or it actually resides in another country or other areas of the world itself. But we have to ensure ourselves that we have controls in place or mitigations, as we call it in security, whereby there is reassurance that no matter what happens, that data, for instance, can't be leaked, which is a major issue. So it could be the fact is encryption for data on the move, in motion, could be the key issue. That the fact that we either completely trust the organisation source to, or move that data to, but in order to reassure the auditors, to reassure legislation, we may have to actually encrypt that data so that they may use the data and control it from a strategic perspective, but in order to ensure the customers and privacy and trust is maintained, we may have to put certain other in-depth issues actually on there. So in essence, it becomes the fact that we have to encrypt data on the flow and decrypt it when we actually need it at a point of presence. So it depends actually on the environment, the financial sector, or whether it's actually a distribution sector. Really, how valuable is that information? I mean, to throw back the question to you, in a sense, is to turn around and say to you, would you be happy that your medical records, are no longer held within the actual health authority in New Zealand, for instance, and they're actually being held in India, and they're not encrypted, or someone potentially is actually going to use that data for their own economic.
Well, I guess there's two parts to that question. First part is one happy that their records are going to be held offshore somewhere else in an unknown location. I think the majority of people, other than people have some sort of innate fear around that, the majority of people would say we don't care, providing the second requirement is met, and that is that the information is safe. And I guess what we're agreeing on is that virtual private clouds, the cloud generally, is allowing an organisation to put the onus of providing a service onto a third party, but the requirement for ensuring that that is safe in whatever, by whatever way you define safe, still lies on the organisation itself.
Yes, absolutely. But I think a lot of it's going to be tied into contractual, but also not purely just contractual, and basically the outsourcer becomes part of your operation, It's more, as I said before, a trust relationship, a partnership, a true partnership. So the last question was about how trust actually comes into the whole area of security, and I mentioned the fact that privacy has a whole set of different attributes which are built in by legislation, but we can say that security involves basically confidentiality, integrity and availability, and also tied to that accountability at the level or measurement that the facts of the right controls are in place. You can take security as a side and then put privacy alongside it and then open up another 10 attributes that you then have to abide by. And privacy becomes a major issue from a customer's perception of, can I trust this organisation, whether it's an issue, whether it's a financial sector, whether it's actually a bank, for instance, or the fact is that you prefer to buy your goods from that particular organisation. They're collecting data, which this comes into the realm of both privacy and trust. Are you collecting that information for the appropriate purpose? And are you only holding on to that information for the appropriate length of time? Or are you protecting that data whilst you're actually holding it before you actually destroy it? And I got reassurance that you're either destroying it at the appropriate time or haven't actually distributed it to every one of your franchises for marketing purposes, for instance, or the fact is it may actually, for argument's sake, the Americans have a term called dumpster diving, okay, where they basically a CD of your data and no longer paper, but the fact is that customer records would have actually put in there, not destroyed, and someone else is then reading that information. So trust comes back, I'll turn it around in a circular fashion, is the fact is trust is becoming extremely important from an organisational, a means of a customer actually measuring how well you are protecting my information, whether I should do business with you, have you got a good reputation, what's your credibility. If you destroy that trust, it is extremely difficult to actually get that level of trust back again. In this day and age and how fast we move in terms of communication, once you've lost that trust, you more or less lost that company in many circumstances, especially small companies, because people, you cannot buy trust in a sense. It's beyond reasonable value to customers. You can imagine a scenario of the fact that a laptop, as you earlier spoke about, if a laptop got stolen, and it's depending on the sector it's actually connected to, whether it's in military, for instance, if that information pertained to 100,000 troops, for instance, then of course they're all going to be rather upset that the fact is potentially their medical records or their details of their history has actually gone out to the public. They want to know where their information has gone to, who has access to it, whether it's actually been fallen into the cyber underground, now being used potentially to target them for other things like spamming attacks and that kind of thing. So trust is something that has to be gained, but it's tied very much unilaterally into both security and privacy. If you lose a proportion of that, that can deteriorate the relationship with the customer and the business, in terms of maybe one or two people move away. That's what happens normally. You can imagine that an organisation which suddenly lost 3,000 or 4,000 customers because their lack of trust with that organisation could be almost incredibly a huge impact to that organisation.